Chapter 3A, Biological Basis of Behavior, Neural Processing and the Endocrine System. So this unit covers the nervous system and your hormone system, or the endocrine system. And what's important to know about this unit and about everything we study in AP Psychology is that everything psychological is simultaneously biological. So when you exhibit a behavior, there usually is a biological basis also involved. And that's what this unit attempts to help explain. The first area we're going to look at is neural communication. The area that we're going to be looking at is biological psychology, which looks at biopsychosocial systems. It takes this approach, which is a very integrated approach to understanding behavior. Biological psychologists study the links between a biological activity and psychological events. They study things like sleep and dreams, the effect of stress and disease, etc. One of the areas they look at very closely is the nervous system, and specifically they look at neurons. There are three types of neurons: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons, and they all have a very distinct function. Sensory neurons carry messages from the body's tissues and sensory organs inward to the brain and the spinal cord. Motor neurons are when the brain and the spinal cord then send instructions out to the body's tissues via these motor neurons. So when the brain and the spinal cord are sending something out to the motor neurons, they go down this message system. Between the sensory and motory output, info is processed in the brain's internal communication system via interneurons. So sensory messages take things outward and bring it into the spinal cord and the brain, where it is then translated. The interneurons are the internal communication system inside the spinal cord and the brain in particular. They then process and then send information back out from the brain and the spinal cord via motor neurons. The parts of a neuron. The bushy dendrite fibers receive information and conduct it toward the cell body. The axon passes the messages along to other neurons or to the muscles or glands. Dendrites are short and axons are long. And one way to remember the idea of axons and the fact that they transmit messages is the old thing. You remember the Navy term anchors away? Well, they have this little take on that called axons away. So an axon actually sends the message. They convey info out throughout the body, down the nerves. Now, insulating the axons of some neurons is something known as myelin sheath. So it covers the neuron. And in cases like multiple sclerosis, this is when the myelin degenerates. And so the myelin actually is a layer that is laid down up to age 25. And one of the things it does is it helps speed the impulses as they travel along the axon. So as this myelin grows, it aids in neural efficiency, it aids in judgment and self-control. So those things all grow also up to about age 25. In MS, this myelin degenerates, and this results in a slowing of communication to muscles and eventually loss of muscle control, because it's as if the impulse hits speed bumps and it's slowed down. The terminal branches form junctions with other cells, and in a minute I'll show you a diagram of all of this. The cell body is the cell's life support center. So this is a diagram of a neuron. So you see the dendrites on the end, the bushy part, that receive messages from other cells. In the center is the cell body, which is the life support center, the nucleus. Then you have the axon, where the nerve impulses are transmitted across it through a process called action potential, which I'll discuss in a moment. And the axon passes those messages away from the cell body to other neurons, muscles, or glands. Around the axon is a coating known as the myelin sheath, which I was talking about, and this can help speed the neural impulses across the axon. It is not found on all nerves, but many kinds it is. And then at the end are the terminal branches of the axon, and at the very tips of those terminal branches are the terminal buttons. But those are what form junctions with other cells, and so that they're extremely important. And that's what eventually, when the action potential occurs, it goes through the terminal branches and it causes the release of the neurotransmitters, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Neurons are extremely fast in their transmission of these impulses. They range anywhere from 2 to 200 miles per hour, and we usually measure them in milliseconds, or thousandths of a second. So we're talking about an extremely fast process. Now, how a neuron fires is a process known as the action potential. And the action potential is a brief electrical charge that travels down the axon. Neurons act a lot like batteries. They generate electricity from chemical events, and they do this through the exchange of ions. Now, in an axon, in a resting axon, the fluid on the inside of that axon has an excess of negatively charged ions, while the fluid on the outside of the axon has more positively charged ions. So positive outside, negative inside, the state is called the resting potential. Now the axon's surface is selectively permeable, meaning it is selective about what it allows to penetrate the surface, what it allows to come into the inside. When a neuron fires, a big process occurs. This process we call the action potential. But when the neuron fires, the first bit of the axon, the very first bit of it, opens the gates. And positively charged sodium ions flood in through the membrane of the axon. And it goes into the interior of the axon and depolarizes that section of the axon. Because it basically overcomes, the positive overcomes the negative charges inside. And this then opens the next section of the axon. And it proceeds like dominoes. During a resting pause, called the refractory period, the neuron pumps those positively charged ions back outside the membrane. So it's prepared to fire again. It resets itself. And in myelinated neurons, the action potential speeds up the hopping from one myelin sausage, is kind of what it looks like, a sausage link, to another. Now, most of the signals the neuron receives are excitatory signals. They're like pushing a neuron's accelerator. But some are inhibitory, meaning they are like putting on a brake. If excitatory signals exceed the inhibitory signals, they cross the threshold and the combined signals trigger an action potential. If they don't, no response will occur. So this is an illustration of an axon potential, and it's showing you a little section there of the cell body end of an axon. And so you have neuron stimulation. It causes a change in the electrical charge. And if it's strong enough, it will depolarize the inside of that axon, which will cause an action potential, which is basically like an electrical charge. It stimulates the next part of the axon to have its gates open to allow those positive ions to flood in, and the process just continues. And that's how it transmits the impulse along the nerve. Okay? And then once it has jumped from one axon to the next, the action potential travels down the axon. The previous link in that axon will go through what they call the refractory period. It resets itself by pumping those positive ions back outside the axon to set it up, to reset it for another impulse. Now, neurons communicate with each other through the synapse. This is the meeting point between neurons. When an action potential reaches the knob-like terminals at the axon's end, it triggers the release of a neurotransmitter. These are like chemical messengers. And within 1/10,000th of a second, these neurotransmitters cross what we call the synaptic gap, which is the space between two neurons, and they bind to receptor sites on the receiving neuron. The receiving neuron then, for an instant, unlocks tiny channels at the receiving site, and electrically charged atoms, either exciting or inhibiting the receiving neuron's readiness to fire. So when they cross over and they go to the receiving site, these electrically charged atoms will either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron's readiness to fire. Then, in a process called reuptake, the sending neuron reabsorbs any excess neurotransmitters so that the synaptic gap is then clear. And this is an illustration of how that occurs. So as you see, the sending neuron has an action potential. Once it reaches the terminal branch, it then will cause a neuron's axon to stimulate the terminal branch. This will cause neurotransmitters to be released through the ends of the terminal branches, the buttons, into the synaptic gap. Then the receptor sites on the receiving neuron will receive those neurotransmitters. And then those neurotransmitters will start the process all over again on that nerve's axon. Okay? And then the sending neuron will reabsorb the excess neurotransmitter molecules in a process called reuptake. And it is in this process, in this synaptic gap, that a lot of the psychiatric medicines, this is where they are involved. So they will either increase the reuptake or decrease the reuptake of these neurotransmitters. They will increase the neurotransmitters. It's very interesting. This is where they do their work, is in this synaptic gap.